Once again, as I said, thank you very much for having the patience to listen to me post lunch. I've been asked to speak on the question of globalization, and of course and I think the first point that we need to ask is exactly what is the definition of globalization, because globalization is defined in multiple ways. But I think I'd like to stick to what is more commonplace kind of definitions of this thing. And I think for a lot of us, globalization really means, in a sense, westernization. A westernized lifestyle, a lifestyle that is based on Europe, United States, etc., both sides of the Atlantic, the goods and services that they consume, the kind of job opportunities they have, the lifestyles they have. So in a large part of the world, I think globalization is basically taken as co-terminus with westernization. This has in fact been one of the reasons why globalization has not been popular in many parts of the world, and why in fact the left has taken advantage of this identification of globalization with westernization to basically condemn globalization as, in a sense, cultural imperialism, changing indigenous cultures, changing indigenous ways of thought, etc., and economies into a way which is not only westernized, but basically suits the interests of the West. Now, for about 300 years, the West's interest was dominant in the whole globe. So it's even today, many years after that situation is getting reversed, it's still possible to have a large degree of credibility to claims that there is still an effort to ensure that the people in the West are getting undue advantage through a particular process. So for a long time, the globalization was fought by several people on the ground that it is westernization, culturally and economically, and that it promotes Western interests and Western wants, Western values, etc., at the expense of other cultures. I mean, let's talk about Asia, frankly, because that's our continent and that's what I'm most familiar with. So I'd rather confine myself. So many people in Asia had a negative perception of globalization because of that. Of course, the reality is now that over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a huge change. Even this country has participated in that change. I remember at in the 1990s, I think Ambassador Sharma will remember that clearly. There was a hectic debate in India about the liberalization policies pursued by P.V. Narasimha Rao. And there was a fear that India is going to be taken over by Western companies. New East India Company is going to emerge. Again, we are going to become from a political colony to at least an economic colony of dominant Western powers. It was very interesting that when you traveled in, let's say, Europe in 2005 and till about the start of 2006, many European newspapers were carrying stories about how European companies were being gobbled up by Indian companies. I mean, that was the age of the Tata takeover of Chorus. That is the age of ArcelorMittal. In fact, our own Manipal group, of which I am I happen to be a director for about 10 years, and I've attended exactly one board meeting in all these 10 years. I've been given leave of absence all through, which is, I think, a very good testimony as to how much value they place on my advice in the board. But in any case, the fact is that even we, in Manipal, there are several international companies that we have taken over as a group, both the education segment of Manipal as well as the non-education, the business side of Manipal. At least about 15, 16 companies in Europe and the United States have been taken over by entities of the Manipal group. So there was a reverse fear that the Indians are coming. You had the Mr. Mittal coming and taking over Arcelor. You had Tata coming and taking over Chorus, Jaguar, Land Rover, iconic British brands taken over by Indians. So, of course, unfortunately or fortunately, the government of India, with its usual efficiency, has ensured that Indian companies have a very raw deal. And because of the policy of high taxes, high interest rates, and high regulation that has been followed for the last 5 or 6 years, that particular sunrise seems to have set quite a bit, with the result that Indian companies are no longer as aggressive in foreign markets. But the reality, of course, is once a setup comes in India which is more friendly to Indian economic growth, Very soon, I think, the predator instincts of the Indian corporate class are going to assert themselves, and you're going to see a big spurt in takeovers by Indian companies. I mean, if I can be a little more broad-ranging here in terms of globalization, because globalization is a societal function. It affects society. And I'm glad to say that if you talk in terms of managers, for example, business managers, now some of us who have traveled across the globe, some of us who have lectured across the globe, dealt with companies and corporates across the globe, we can in a sense identify Indian managers, European managers, American managers, Chinese managers. I'm happy to tell you, among the most aggressive managers in the international globalized world today are Indian managers. Whether they are fund managers, whether they're commodity managers, whether they're managers dealing with industrial enterprises, Indians are absolutely aggressive, ruthless, and they climb very fast. Now you have places like Europe, for example, which have still got several glass ceilings. I mean, there is still a lot of blockades to those of different ethnicities in Europe. But fortunately in the United States, those blockades are largely absent, with the result that in US business today, there's a very heavy presence of Indian ethnic origin managers. Even in Europe, something as iconic as Deutsche Bank has now got a co-chief who's an Indian. They could not accept the fact that you had an Indian as the chief, so they got a good proper German to be the co-chief. This guy is producing 90% of the profit and doing about 70% of the work. But for the sake of ethnic satisfaction, you have a German and an Indian sharing the top spot in Deutsche Bank. So what I want to tell you is that globalization has changed an awful lot from what it was in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 60s, when it was seen as some kind of a Western plot to take over. Whether it's a Western plot or not, I don't know, because I'm not privy to what was discussed in Paris or London or Washington. But certainly that plot has not worked. And today, you are seeing a huge flow of managers from South Korea, from China, from India, from Taiwan, who are now going across the globe, taking over companies in a large way. And if you look at the newspaper headlines today, you will see Apple versus Samsung. Now, I don't think Apple is going to get very much of breathing room from this, in my view, absurd judgment of giving it $1 billion, naturally by a US judge. I mean, I'm not going to make any aspersion of the judiciary in America, except to say it's an American judiciary, and it has favored an American company in an extraordinary way. But I don't think it's going to be long before Samsung starts similar kind of activities in Asia, because today, no company in the world can be blocked from the Asian market and survive. You can survive without the European market. You can survive without the American market. You cannot survive without doing extensive business in Asia. So essentially, the old concept of globalization has been turned on its head. And today, it's in a sense Asia that has got the most to gain, in a sense, from a process of global industry. So for decades, for centuries, it was not Asia. For centuries, Asia was the receiving end. But today, very definitely, it is Asia, including India, which has got an enormous amount to gain from a globalizing world, which is why today, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the United States, you find heavy voices of protectionism. People are much more protectionist in Europe than they are in India. And India is relatively more protectionist than, say, South Korea or Taiwan. And, they're much more. But you find a lot of voices